In at number 10, we have the Rock Drake, and in my opinion, this creature had to make the list as it is an absolute cheese on Arboration for defeating Rockwell, and although maybe that's not the biggest percentage of all Arc maps, only being one of the main maps, which I think there are like 6 or 7, but still, I think considering how easy that boss is made because of this creature, it deserves to be on the list. And also, it just is a great creature apart from that, but there's not really many other uses on other maps for this creature. You can't really use it for other bosses, and also just transferring from Arboration can be a huge pain anyway, so you always want to be quite careful with that. But considering these creatures being just so great for doing any cheesing of the Rockwell boss on Arboration, I think they just had to make the list. Although yes, more of a rare case, still to me it really does just it deserves to be here. Next up, we have the Megatherium, and this creature again has a more specific case, although you can use it for a lot of bosses out there, although its main use is for any boss that has the Broodmother or just the Broodmother included, as sometimes some maps just like to mash together a couple of bosses and then just make that the final boss of the Arc map. And you can kind of say the Overseer sort of does that as well, but you know, that's a little bit of an unworthy case, I would say, because you know there's loads of other bosses you're facing as well at the same time, and you've got the Overseer, really not very useful for that fight, although they can get through the tech cave with relative ease compared to something like a Rex. But the reason why these things are actually just so good at defeating things like the Broodmother is because of a ability which they have, which allows them to deal insane damage to insects, and they can get that by killing an insect. And maybe you might think, well, you just have to kill the Broodmother and then you get the buff. Well, the Broodmother spawns loads of Urania minions, so it's really easy and quick to get that buff. And then if you have a UT buffing it on top of it as well, it really does play a huge part in any kind of given boss scenario. And actually, talking about the UT, I didn't put it on this list, and I didn't put the Daedon on it either, but I'm going to give them a quick mention here, as they are pretty much largely essential boss creatures, although maybe not strictly necessary for dealing that damage. They really do increase your chances of winning a fight, and I kind of feel bad for not mentioning them. Next up, we have the Megalosaurus, and this really is a great boss creature, especially for maps like Arboration, again, although it is useful on some other maps too, so it had to be included on this list in my opinion. Like, you look at this creature, it really does pack a punch in the damage department, and they're quite small, so if you want to get through the tech cave, you're not going to have too much of an issue, especially on ASA, because of the Dino implemented features where they can actually go round objects and be somewhat smart compared to just normal arcs, where they'll just take the shortest path, or at least try to, and then probably just end up falling into some lava, and then you won't end up having a particularly good time, and really not going to sit nicely for an experience for you. And you can actually see one of the abilities here. This thing is gripping a Microraptor in its mouth, and it just tears it to shreds, and then once it's dead, you can just keep going with your life, I guess, as an Arc creature. But it's kind of nice because Microraptors are absolute pests, although you don't really find them in any boss environment. Quite useful for some Dimorphodons on the Dragon boss fight though, as they can quickly snatch those up and kill them, as they are an absolute nuisance as they damage the rider, and they can really decrease the chances of you actually winning that boss fight. So that is an extremely great use of these creatures. If you don't have Theres, I would recommend using the Megalosaurus or the Megalosaurus and some Theres, so you can get those Dimorphodons, very different creatures, taken out while still being able to not have all your creatures die because of the incredibly OP fire buff, which really does hurt any kind of carnivorous creature. Speaking of the Theri, in number 7, we do have the Theri, and I kind of talked about the rationale behind this creature being here, and it is really great for the dragon boss fight, or any boss fight that has the dragon in it, of course, as it's going to have that fire ability, which is not going to be particularly friendly to any carnivorous creature, but also this thing's shadow does unlock at level 69. Now, apart from that absolutely amazing thing coming from the saddle level of this creature, it's also a great gatherer, although that doesn't really make it a particularly great boss creature, but it does gather fiber quite well. So apart from being a really good boss creature, this thing is really good at just general resource gathering, which is another reason to tame it if you're not thinking of doing bosses currently. And it doesn't really matter what map you're on, if a Theris spawns there, they are going to be extremely useful, as they do spawn on every map, I'm pretty sure. Like, they're kind of just that common creature that you don't not have on any given map. And although yes, on official, their taming does take a little bit of a while considering their size, but it's mainly just because of the food you give them. It's a lot easier to get prime meat than some like vegetables, which you obviously have to grow and you have to do that hard process. You can use kibble, of course, but still, generally this is going to take a lot longer than the carnivorous tame, but it still is well worth it, especially if you're thinking of doing the dragon boss fight, or if you just really need a lot of fiber in your life. Next up, we have the Giga, and this thing has to be included here for its insanely great use on extinction. Although nowadays there is one creature which has sort of replaced it, which is later on in the list, and you'll hear about that creature maybe in just a couple of minutes. And either way, this creature, if you can tell already, deals a huge amount of damage, and it really does have the health to pack a punch as well. It makes it a really useful creature for that. Its only real downsides is its rage meter and its terrible stamina. Although you probably won't be riding this creature when using it, considering that they're mainly used for the Titan boss fights, and you're going to have loads of these things anyway, and you might be riding something like a mech, or maybe just another equivalent creature, although you can end up on Gigas at some point. You might want to use the UT to buff it up, although you really don't want to get near that damage zone, as that UT is going to die very quickly. And if you're doing the Desert Titan on Extinction, you're going to want to use a Quetzal instead. You really can't use Gigas for this thing. The Quetzal is the best creature for it, so I'm going to give it a slight mention here as well, although it's pretty much only useful for that boss fight. And you can kind of say the Moser is really great for the Moda boss fight, the same as the Megalodon, although they're in extremely rare cases, and they're not even the main bosses of the map, apart from obviously that previous example, but the Moda isn't the main boss of Genesis Part 1. In at number 5, we have got the Spino, and I know I've already talked about it earlier, but I kind of want, if I was to put the UT on this list, I would put it in at this spot, as I think all the creatures past it the better, but it's kind of on par where the Spino is. It's just you're quite limited when you've only got 10 creatures on the list, and maybe I should have spent a little bit more time thinking and considering. And for the Daedon, for that example, I would have probably put that in at like number 9, number 8. That's kind of where it sits, as is less essential. You kind of maybe put the Snowmail there as well, but that is in even rarer cases, so I don't really think it deserves to make the list. But the reason why the Spino is here is because of this thing's great mobility, and it also deals quite a huge amount of damage as well, which again does play huge benefit for this creature. You can get a creature which deals insane amounts of damage and also has quite high mobility. Compared to something like the Rex though, it does lack in the health department, but it's just so mobile. It really is a creature worth considering. And actually, if I'm doing the Megapithecus at boss fight, I might actually use Spinos for it. I'll use Megatherians for the Broodmother, then obviously Theres for the Dragon, and then I'll use these things for the Megapithecus, although I have used Rexes for all 3 bosses on the island. Mainly the Megapithecus, of course. I pretty much only go for Theres if I'm sticking to just creatures on the island. Otherwise, all of these bosses can be pretty easily done with the Deinonychus, but that is much later on the list. Either way, these things have the hydration buff as well, so they're actually pretty useful for the Moda if you want to do that. On top of that, they can turn 360 on the spot, again playing to their mobility, and they can stand up on their hind legs, dealing even more damage. Sadly, they don't have the bleed ability, but still a very great boss creature. Next up, we have the Carcharodontosaurus. Sorry about that blurry picture there, I really do need to find a new one, but my previous one got deleted and I've looked, but I can't really find one. Maybe AI can do something in the future, or I'll just find that previous image wherever that thing's gone. But either way, this is essentially just the Giga upgrade. This creature is the Giga, but it doesn't have the rage buff. It deals more damage, and obviously because of that rage buff, it actually means this creature has more health, as it doesn't go into rage, and it will stay fighting right till 0 HP, which is really a huge benefit, and it makes this creature significantly more reliable to tame and to use than the Giga. Actually, maybe not to tame, because these things are really not the most reliable to tame because of their taming methods. A lot more things can go wrong. It's not just a simple knockout tame. You've got to drag creatures to it, and then after that you've got to let it eat those creatures, and it can't kill any other creatures for a significant amount of time, obviously until that blood rage fades away, because it can't be in a blood rage while you're taming it. But then after you've got it past that stage, it really isn't too hard to go around and kill loads of creatures and then actually tame it, although it's kind of sad that you get knocked off when you tame it, because you don't need a saddle to tame this thing, but then as soon as it is tamed, you do need a saddle to ride it. Just a little nitpick from me, but again, this is going to be a really useful creature for the bosses on Extinction, and that's pretty much it. But it really does play a huge part, and it is a very huge damage dealer, and I had to put it on the list. In at number 3, we have the Rex, and this kind of had to be here, okay? It's such a well-balanced carnivore, in my opinion. It just had to make the list. When you look at this thing, it deals a very hefty amount of damage. It has a very good health stat. Although its mobility isn't the greatest, you don't need that all too much in general combat scenarios, and it really does pack a punch, and it's ridiculously easy to tame, especially on ASA, as you can literally take this thing as a baby by just killing its parents and then just simply pressing a button, and unless you're on official, it will raise pretty quickly, as you can just have a Rex like that. And drops are very commonly found with Rex saddles on ASA, because drops are so much more OP on ASA than just general normal Arc, kind of as they should be, and you see that in the later DLC maps of Arc when you go into like Gen 2 and all of that. Drops kind of seem to fix themselves. Don't know why they haven't really done that for the island, but maybe they're just like, it doesn't need, the island is just, it's what it is now. It's just that first map that, although it's been really well designed, it does lack in a few features that the other maps really deliver, and sometimes, you know, there are some features in the new maps you kind of take for granted, although you don't really notice that too much in your Arc playing. It's just a couple of nitpicks when you go to like Gen 2 and all those newer maps. There's just a few things which just, they work better, not it work better. What is wrong with my grammar today? But yeah, sadly also the Rex doesn't deal the bleed ability, but it can do the roar and knock people off their riders. Again, not really too useful for bosses, but want to pair with a UT and get this thing buffed even more. Its health will last in any decently long boss fight, especially on Gen 1 actually. It's extremely useful for the Master Controller, and you know, they deal a quite hefty amount of damage and are really useful for just any kind of general boss fight that isn't one on Extinction. In at number 2, we have got the Shadow Mane, and in my opinion, this had to be here. And although its tame method is kind of a little bit annoying, and a lot of things can go wrong along the way, once you've tamed a very high level male and female, you can simply breed these things and get that breeding chain going and getting yourself some really nice Shadow Manes, and then you don't have to do too much Shadow Mane taming. That's why I don't really recommend going for a low level first time. Just go for the highest level you can find, get a male and a female, and just get them breeding right away, because frankly it isn't really worth it. You can get better stats with breeding creatures, and they are particularly quite a pain to tame. But the thing about these Shadow Mane, they have very decent damage, very decent health, and very decent mobility, and also they come at quite a decent size as well. And if you transfer onto the island, the Tech Cave becomes an absolute breeze when using a creature like this. But also just any general boss fight, they're pretty good for the Master Controller, although I've never used them for that. Really, I've seen some other people use it for them though, and they've been really successful with it. The reason why I haven't is they weren't actually out at the time I did the Master Controller, but I have used them for Rockwell on Gen 2 and all of the island bosses, and also all the bosses on Ragnarok, and they work really well. The only real hurdle is getting over that taming method. And finally, in at number 1, we have got the Deinonychus. In my opinion, I just have to put this thing here. The fact that this can deal bleed damage to bosses is an absolute game changer, and any of the bosses where you use Rexes or Megatheriums and Derries, these creatures are going to be extremely useful for all of those. As with the bleed ability, those bosses can be very quickly done, and you don't really have to worry about the dragon's breathing attack, as that boss is going to go through so quickly, and even when it's in the air, that health is still going to be draining down. So it really does play a huge part in the Arc boss experience, and compared to the Shadow Mane, they are significantly easier to tame. Like, you compare the tame method for the Shadow Mane to this thing, they are so much easier to tame, and although they aren't quite as mobile because they can't jump like 10 million feet into the air, they still do have quite a lot of mobility. They don't take full damage. They have the pack buff. Sadly, they lose on the hydration buff, but you know, you're probably not going to be using these things for the Moda, and general boss arenas don't tend to have water in it, so not too useful for boss scenarios, although it can be useful in some cases. Either way, these creatures, in my opinion, are just so good at defeating bosses. Again, I need to say it, that bleed ability really does become an absolute game changer, and just for general use as well, they're really great creatures for just killing anything and traveling the map. So they're really great multi-use creatures as well, but they're mainly used for me in bosses, and I really don't know where I'd be in Arc if I didn't have the Deinonychus here. Actually, probably with the Shadowmane, but in my opinion, this is a far superior creature. In at number 10, we have the Crystal Wyvern, and there are many reasons why I think that this creature should make the list, and the first reason for it is because of just how easy these things are to tame, but also just how useful they are on top of that as well. They pretty much just have the same use as the Wyvern, and they even have the hydration buff, although maybe not all too the most useful, as you know, you kind of need to like get those wings in the water without you actually touching the water. That's not the most useful thing for these creatures to have, but they do have it, which is, it's nice to have, I guess. And with the tame method being a passive one, it becomes a lot easier than a normal Wyvern tame. And yes, you do need Primal Crystal, which you know you get by knocking out a Wyvern, Crystal Wyvern of course, and you need to be level 65. I still think it's a lot easier than the normal Wyvern tame, and they're just so useful for general early game flying travel. And you might think, well, level 65 really isn't an early game level. A very basic note run can get you there and even further pretty quickly within your first hour of Arc, unless if you're playing official, that's probably not going to work out for you quite as well. But quite a lot of people these days aren't really playing official, so you know, a lot of people actually watching this channel do play single player, so it would definitely work for that, as everything's 2.5 times if you haven't fiddled with all of these settings. Anyway, so yeah, that's why the Crystal Wyvern is on the list. Next up, we've got the Maywing, and this really is a really great travel mount for me. Don't know why I needed so many reallys in there for me, but you know, either way, this is like the fastest travel mount out there, and it really does act as a good one. Again, the really is returning. More reallys, please, I guess. Either way, essentially this uses the gliding technique rather than the just general flying technique, which can be a little bit of a disadvantage, but still I really think it does play a just general huge part in my Arc traveling, because gliders usually tend to have a faster speed, and the Maywing isn't all too bad on flatter terrain compared to a creature like the Rock Drake, which came earlier. It doesn't feel as ergonomic to control as the Maywing, and that might just be because I've spent less time with it, or it might just be that it actually can't really handle those flatter terrains quite as well. But also, the Maywing isn't just a gliding mount. This thing also really does pack a punch when it comes to breeding, as it acts as a portable feeding trough, and it can gather berries on top of that as well. The only slight downside is that animation is a little bit disturbing, but the fact you can get this thing saddle at level 19, it really is an absolute godsend to have this creature. Next up, we've got the Megalodon, and this may be a little bit of an unpopular opinion among many of you, but I actually really like this creature as an underwater tame. And yes, the Basilote is a really great one, and you could do that as well. And there actually is another creature which I use for underwater travel, which is much later on in the list, which I use over this thing. But actually, just for general, like, for doing the Moda and just for general underwater travel, I will use this creature, like, most of the time, you could say. Maybe I'd use the other creature, which I'm not going to spoil what it is, but just, like, mainly, I would say mainly for combat underwater, or if I'm maybe, like, transporting some stuff and I need to actually kind of pack more of a punch down in the underwater depths, I will take a Megalodon with me, because I'm not going to take a Moda. They're just a bit too big and bulky for me, and although Basilote does work, it does have that depth limit, so no, not the friendliest, and a Megalodon really can fight back, apart from, like, electric eels and jellyfish, which it struggles with a little bit, but I still think, considering its size and its damage and the fact that it deals bleed, it's a really great creature to have. In at number 7, we have got the RG, and this creature really is a huge one when it comes to me and just my general Arc day-to-day life, as this creature is so useful for just getting around the map and just getting things done, really. When you look at this creature and you look at how much metal it can transport because of that weight stat, and you look at how easy it is to tame, it really is a truly great one, which I can't not use at all in Arc. I have to use this creature. It's partly maybe some nostalgia reasons, because I've been using the RG for absolutely ages, but I really think this is like one of the best flyers in the game. It's a pretty good travel mount, although maybe not the quickest out there, and it really does pack a punch in the damage department, which you maybe wouldn't expect quite as much, because, you know, it's an RG. You wouldn't expect it to do that much damage. It can also carry creatures in its beak as well, which is kind of nice, but I don't really need to carry a dodo around with me in its beak, so I don't really use that all too much. Its saddle also acts as a smithy, so if any of your metal stuff breaks along the way, you can always just repair that. If you have some metal ingots on you, it's not going to refine metal ingots like a phoenix does. And also when it kills something and then it eats that dead corpse, it will get a regen buff, which, you know, so it's a nice ability for it to have. Next up, we have got the Snow Owl, and in my opinion, this just has a slight edge over the RG in quite a lot of factors, and maybe almost everything apart from the metal gathering and travel and the fact that it's got the regen buff and the smithy as a saddle. But the Snow Owl has some more compelling features, you could say, which make this a better creature in my opinion, and one which I am more likely to go for. Obviously it's less accessible because it doesn't spawn on the island, but still I really do think this is a better creature for me and probably a lot of players out there. Namely, this creature is significantly faster than the RG, and it does have that gliding ability. You could kind of say it's more of a diving ability. It's something along those lines. It's not really like a glide as a glider would have because it is a flyer, but it really does tremendously speed up these creatures. But it also has kind of a heat vision ability, which, you know, is actually quite nice to have for me as a PvE player, because if I ever lose a creature for some reason, like, I can quite easily find it. It tends to be wild, not really tamed ones, because I use Creature Finder Deluxe for that and I can just find them anyway. But still, in a pinch, just if you want to find a small wild creature around you, it's quite useful to have. You also want to crank that stamina, not just so they can fly long distances, but they can actually heal up dinos. They're essentially just a Daedon on steroids. You can't really use these things in like general standard boss fights because they don't allow flyers in, and obviously this thing's not allowed in. But for like just if you want to heal up our creatures, or if you want to heal up wild creatures, if you're taming something and then its health got really low because you just trank it for ages and you just need to give it a break so you can continue tranking it, just heal it up with this creature and then you don't have to wait for ages, and then its torpor won't go down quite as much, and yeah, you're going to have a much more successful tame. And obviously if you feed the Snow Owl pellets to Gatchas, you really are going to get some insane loot. I know that has been nerfed since release, but still you can get some quite OP stuff, so I really do recommend the Snow Owl if you've never had one already. Next up, in number 5, we've got the Shadowmane, and this creature is just here for its insanely great mobility and just general overall skill in boss scenarios, combat scenarios, travel scenarios, underwater scenarios, and just generally being a really great creature overall. Firstly, this thing does have really high mobility stats, like it can zoom across the map and it can kind of jump really high. It's a little bit scary actually. You should always beware if you're on a flyer and there's a Shadowmane, because it can just jump up and just absolutely decimate you. But also these things do have the pack buff, they can go invisible, and they have the hydration buff too, which again barely any creatures have, and it makes a lot more sense for this creature than like the Crystal Wyvern, because they're a land creature, so you can actually go underwater with these things, and they are actually really great in that scenario. The only real downside to these creatures is the tame method is pretty annoying, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong with it, but once you do have one, you really do have yourself an insanely great mount, which I think all of you out there should be taming as long as you have a map where this thing actually spawns on, as it truly is a terrific creature. Next up, we have got the Desmodus, and in my opinion, this thing just kind of had to be here for several reasons. Like, this thing can make Sanguine Elixir, which is absolutely OP, and also on top of that as well, this creature is just really mobile, and it can also pick players off mounts as well, which is quite OP for any given PvP scenarios. And on top of that, does have the gliding ability as well, which, you know, does play quite a big benefit to it. And although maybe its tame method can be a little bit annoying, this thing can farm blood bags as well. So once you've got one, the next one is going to be significantly easier than the next, but it kind of does go like that for quite a lot of tames out there. Once you have one, it makes it easier to do the next one, unless it's just a knockout tame, then it's pretty much the same each time, and then it just depends on what kind of resources you have at the time. But yeah, the Desmodus truly is a great creature, and considering it spawns on Fjorda, it's really accessible to pretty much all Arc players out there, apart from Switch and mobile players, although they do tend to make up a smaller minority of the general population of Arc players out there. This may be unpopular, but in number 3, I've got the Baryonyx, and why am I putting this thing above the Desmodus? Well, I think it's more of a useful creature to me, and although that 30% on tames is such a cool ability to have, the usefulness of this creature being such a great caving mount to me, and considering how useful doing caves is in Ark, compared to like getting 30% taming on a creature, to me, the Baryonyx just seems like the better option, which I'd go for. I know it isn't a flyer and all of that, and maybe it doesn't have as many abilities behind it, but it's so invaluable for all of its caving abilities, and with its one kind of ability which it does have, it makes it pretty useful for the underwater caves, as it can stun creatures up to the size of a Megalodon. You see that a little bit later in the B-roll, and considering it's got pretty good health, pretty decent damage, very good mobility, especially for a carnivore, but it does make sense considering its size. It's really good underwater as well. It's got actually some pretty decent speed on it, which again does make it a really great caving mount, as you do probably want quite a quick creature. What even? It's like I've got a dysfunction with saying R sounds, but yeah, that's why I put the Barry at number 3. Feel free to disagree with me. It's just my opinion really on this creature. I really like the Barry. At number 2, we have got the Bloodstalker, and in my opinion, this is the best ocean creature. And you might not think of it like that, but for me, this is the epitome of ocean travel. This creature absolutely soars under the water, and although in this bureau I've got absolutely nothing which shows this actually being underwater, I only skim over the top of it. I'll probably have to change that when these things come out in ASA, or I might just redo the B-roll for this creature at some point, because I really do use these things for underwater travel a lot. They can quickly get away from electric eels and jellyfish, which again makes them quite useful for that job, because they are absolute pests of the ocean and you're not going to have a good time if you encounter one of them. These creatures also just on the land as well really do have quite a lot of speed behind them, which really again does benefit them quite heavily. And also on top of that, if you're on Gen 1, you can get some hexagons out of these things by doing some missions with them. And I've actually done the alpha mission for the bog race. I know maybe not the biggest achievement, but you could definitely fly the Bloodstalker once you've done that. I'm a little bit rustier now just for general travelling around, because I mainly just use these things for underwater travel, and that's what I prefer them for, and that's kind of what I use these creatures for. But they are just packed with loads of other abilities as well, and you kind of turn into Spider-Man when riding this thing. And also their tame method is the exact same as the Desmodus. I should really say it the other way around, because obviously this creature came first, and thanks to the Desmodus actually being able to get loads of blood bags, it also does make Bloodstalker taming a lot easier. So I do actually really thank that creature for coming out and allowing Bloodstalker tames to be easier, because it really is a great creature. And finally, in at number 1 is the Deinonychus, and this really does just play such a huge role for me in just general amazingness of Ark creatures. It really is a great boss creature, and it's really just great for general ability and just generally kind of everything in Ark apart from resource gathering, although you know you have some other creatures that you can use the Anki and all of that, but I tend to not spend a lot of time talking about resource gatherers in Ark. I kind of just don't really appreciate them as much, and I probably should, but this thing can bleed damage to bosses, which is kind of an insane ability to have, which no other Ark creature has, and this thing, it really does bosses well. Like, you compare it to any other creature on the islands which can go into the bosses, and it does so much better than them, and it can kill them so quickly, especially because it has the pack buff, so you can just absolutely decimate tons of creatures. And again, that high mobility really is going to play a huge role when it comes to actually killing those bosses, and also just avoiding those bosses as well, because having a high mobility, you know, it's easy to get away from things, and you can kind of deal more damage just by hopping around it. You can it's not in most cases, but still there are some cases where that tends to work. It's mainly just for dodging stuff rather than dealing more damage, but also you can just see they're great for just general traversing of normal maps too, which again does play a huge benefit, and they can just be used as like normal travel mounts, and especially considering how easy they are to tame, they really are a no-brainer, and I think everyone should be taming themselves a Deinonychus. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I really hope that you enjoyed this one, and as always, comment down below, what is your must-have Ark tame? Do you agree with this list? If not, comment your top 10 down below, and as always, I'll see you all later.